Good day and welcome to our annual National Forum on Literacy and Technology. We will begin shortly, but please allow me a quick word to address Francophone viewers who are with us in order to have them activate the closed captioning in French. Bonjour à toutes et tous, bienvenue à notre forum sur la littératie et la technologie. Le forum se déroulera en anglais avec des sous-titres en français. Pour activer le sous-titrage, il devrait y avoir un pop-up dans la visionneuse multimédia de votre écran. Cliquez sur « Continuer » si vous ne l'avez pas encore fait. Ceci devrait activer les sous-titres dans votre boîte multimédia. Ensuite, pour augmenter la taille de la boîte, vous pouvez cliquer sur « Show Hide Header » situé dans le coin inférieur droit. Voilà. Normalement, les sous-titres devraient apparaître lorsqu'on passera en anglais. À noter que c'est une traduction en direct, alors il est possible que quelques fautes s'y glisseront. Nous vous remercions de votre compréhension à cet effet. Si vous avez des problèmes techniques, s'il vous plaît, l'inscrire dans le chat. Nous serons en contact avec vous individuellement pour vous assister. Merci et bon forum. Thank you. I'll now pass it over to our host. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And let me take this opportunity to welcome all to the Frontier College National Forum on Literacy and Technology, a very timely topic for sure. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. More than 700 people have signed up for this, and we think that's just spectacular. So we hope you'll enjoy the discussion over the next 90 minutes or so. My name is Stephen Fall, and I have the real privilege of serving as president of Frontier College. A little more about us in a moment, but first I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. And I want to impress that this is not something we do as part of the housekeeping announcements. Rather, it's something we take very seriously. We have a partnership with about 140 Indigenous communities throughout the country, and we very much value those relationships. With that in mind, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I am coming to you from today, for thousands of years, has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. On a related note, I'd like to acknowledge that today is Orange Shirt Day. That's why I and some of the panelists are wearing orange shirts. This is a day when we recognize the residential school system that was in Canada a few years ago, the impact it had on Indigenous people, and in fact continues to have to this day. It's an annual event in Canada, and if you want more information about it, I'm sure you can find it online. I want to say a word of thanks to our sponsors today. This forum is made possible with the generous support of Canada Life. They are the founding sponsor of this event. We couldn't appreciate their help more. They've been great people to deal with over the years, and I can tell you, I know they care deeply about the communities in which they operate, so we thank them for their long-term support. Likewise with Cisco, another long-term partner of Frontier College. They have generously provided this wonderful interface, the WebEx that you see today. So thank you to both our sponsors. As you heard a few moments ago en français, this discussion will take place in English, but we have made provisions to have it live closed captioned in French. So as my colleague Christina mentioned, if you want to follow along in French, if you've just joined and you maybe missed her announcement, on the right-hand side of your screen, you may see something that says external site and a little blue box that says continue. You need to click on that little blue box, and then you will likely see something in the bottom right-hand corner that says show hide header. And if you click on that, then you'll be able to see the French going by in real time. We do have professional translators helping us today. That being said, if there's the odd mistake along the way, we ask for your indulgence. I know I tend to speak rather quickly, so I will keep in mind that there are people faithfully translating my words, and I'll invite my fellow panelists to also remember that the translation is taking place. Everyone tuned in today is automatically on mute, so there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and you can do that through the chat. And if for some reason that doesn't work for you, you can also email us at literacy@frontiercollege.ca. And we'll probably be having our discussion for an hour or so, and then we'll move on to questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. This session is being recorded, and you won't be seen if you're just attending. What will be on the recording will be the panelists and discussion. So with that behind us, let me say a few words to introduce our topic. As you may know, Frontier College is a long-standing national literacy organization. We started way back in 1899, and I won't give you a year-by-year progress update. Suffice it to say, we've grown over time. We are now coast to coast to coast, and all our programs are free for people who are experiencing low literacy. I will say that without going into enormous data points, it's a more significant problem in Canada than many people realize. And it's critically important because it connects to so many other issues such as employment and income and housing and healthcare. Now more than ever, how critically important it is to be able to read information about healthcare. And the shortest way of saying it is that for millions of people, improving literacy is the key to an even brighter future. Now, until recently, the work of Frontier College and similar organizations was quite often done face-to-face, either one-on-one or one-on small groups. Well, obviously, with the pandemic, that's become, if not impossible, almost impossible. So we, like others, have moved to becoming a very digitally focused organization. And I think for the most part, this has been quite good. We know that research shows us that technology can really help. It can improve learning outcomes. And so that's something we'll talk about today. Maybe we'll be able to get into some best practices. But is it all good? We have to ask ourselves, who's being left behind? Again, at Frontier College, about a quarter of our regular learners can't access us digitally. And that's something we're very concerned about. And then finally, we'll take a look at, is digital all the time good for young brains? And we've got an expert to offer some thoughts on that. We have a great panel today, and I'll be pleased to introduce them to you. And when I introduce you and say a few words about you, maybe you would just say hello and tell us where you're coming from. That way, the listeners and viewers can get a chance to see you on screen. So, first of all, Danielle Baril. Danielle is Director General at the Institute for Cooperation and Adult Education, Chair of the Unesco Institute for Lifelong Learning Governing Board. He sits on the boards of many other education-related organizations. I've had the pleasure of hearing him speak many times in the past. I will tell you, these are my words, not his. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about literacy in Canada. Danielle, welcome. Just tell us where you're coming from today.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm in Montreal.
Okay, well, welcome. We think it's really important during these forums to have the voice of our learners. And we have Marissa Blake joining us today. Marissa is a current learner at Frontier College's Independent Studies program. Marissa, would you just unmute and say hello and tell everyone where you're coming from today?
Hi, everybody. I'm coming from Toronto.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that and welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Tammy Arifra. Tammy is the Toronto Regional Manager for Adult Programs at Frontier College. Tammy, would you say a word or two and just tell us where you're coming from?
Hi, hello everyone. My name's Tammy and I'm from Toronto.
Well, welcome. Now we're going a little further afield now to Denise Williams. Denise is the Chief Executive Officer at the First Nations Technology Council. She is a mentor at Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and an activator at SheEO. Denise, I think you're a little further away, likely the West Coast. Can you just say hello and tell us where you're coming from?
Yeah, that's right, Stephen. Good morning, and good morning to everyone here. I'm thrilled to be sharing virtual space with you here today. I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. And I come from Cowichan tribes myself on Vancouver Island. This land is also known as North Vancouver.
Wonderful. Well, for that, and even further afield, we go to Marianne Wolfe. Marianne is Director for the Center of Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UK. She's written over 170 scientific publications, many of them focusing on the science of the reading brain, and she has some unique perspectives to share for sure. I should note that she is also on the board of the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation. wonderful organization with whom we're happy to partner on a number of things. Marianne, I guess you're not only west, but a bit south. Is that right?
I think I am very much further south than anyone in your audience, but it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say it was also an honor to wear orange to celebrate Orange Day for your Indigenous people. I was so proud to be able to do that and so happy to be with all of you.
Okay, so we're going to get right into the discussion. Thank you all. As I said, we have an excellent panel. So we're going to cover some rather broad areas today. First, the value of digital tools. We'll take a look at the issue of equity in terms of who's able to access and who's not. And then, although I think much of our discussion will be on the positive, we will talk about is the downside of too much digital learning, especially for young minds. So I'm going to start by turning to you, Tammy. Tammy, you work with a Frontier College, and I know recently you've been using a lot of digital tools. Let's start. Where or how can digital tools help our learners best?
Well, I'll start by saying it has been quite a journey and it has not been without challenges. In an ideal world, we are blending the use of technology with our in-person human element. As you've shared, we've had about 25% of our participants who are not able to access services online, and there are still a number who have limited access. With the programs that I support, what we've been attempting to do is offer loaner laptops where we can. We're offering some digital devices in terms of hotspots where we can. The learning has been trial and error in some circumstances, and the learning is really individual to the student, as we all know. We've been using resources such as tablets with math instruction when we were face-to-face. Now online, we may use some online applications where these students are paired with the volunteer one-to-one, and the volunteer or instructor is able to get a sense of how that person is able to navigate that particular platform. We've also piloted some what we call small group sessions where we're still trying to encourage some interaction between participants. One of the challenges of working with digital, working remotely and with only digital devices is that the human element is sometimes missed, and it can be quite challenging. And so in the opportunities where we can partner and pair learners, there's some of that face-to-face and social aspect that's included. The organization, I say as a whole, we've done a fantastic job of trying to shift and pivot. We've used radio stations in terms of story time to connect with individuals who may not have access to technology. We have tried to use Facebook and Facebook Live to do some story times. We've also used things like WhatsApp. And so we've gone a bit lower tech, but we've used WhatsApp to facilitate learning. So we've tried to pivot and use different tools based on the accessibility of technology in that particular area and for that particular learner, and also based on their particular need. It's not a problem that I think we have solved because it can still sometimes feel one-dimensional because it is quite limited, but we are really trying to include a variety of digital tools and how we facilitate and engage our learners. And so I'll stop there in terms of some of the ways in which we've used tools, and perhaps others want to pipe in.
Well, that's tremendous. Thank you. We'll get into a couple of specifics in a minute, particularly about preparing people for the workplace. But I wanted to go to Marianne just briefly. Later on in the discussion, you'll have an opportunity to talk about some of your research. But before we get to that, did you have anything to add about how we can use digital tools to really support learners on their journey? Marianne, I'll just see that I think you may be muted there.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
I was very impressed with what Tammy was describing because there are so many challenges and you're doing a wonderful job, Tammy. I can hear that. From my standpoint as a cognitive neuroscientist, and I'll speak more about, if you will, the threats or the impediments to learning that are involved. But right now I want to say something about the positive. what we have when we learn to read is the building up of a reading circuit. And that circuit has to be able to put together foundational skills with background knowledge, and then eventually learn what I will be calling later in our discussion, the deep reading processes. Well, what is so important and positive about the digital devices is that they can offer teachers a more one-on-one possibility of practicing these foundational skills. And this is a very, very important part of how reading is acquired. We don't want to ever use the term drill. We want to use the term multiple exposure to these aspects of learning the alphabetic principle. So there are two very important positive contributions, and that is the practice it involves. And Tommy talked about how there are individual differences. There are real individual differences in not only what a child brings to bear when they first are learning those early years, but also their conceptual knowledge, what they bring to bear also in terms of background knowledge. And so the digital platform offers two very important aspects. And we can talk about the threats or the impediments later, but let's begin with the positive.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. There's lots of positives to discuss. Denise, I wondered if I could just ask you to jump in here and remember to unmute. I wondered if you could talk to us a little about how we might prepare learners for the workplace. One of the things we've experienced at Frontier College is that people come to us, and they may not be terribly old, but their situation is that from when they started their studies or they started their work, things have changed quite a bit. All of a sudden, we have automation. Instead of doing something manually, they're being given a computer manual. And I wonder if you've encountered that, or if we can help prepare learners for the new digital environments in workplaces.
Yeah, certainly. Well, here at the First Nations Technology Council, we do a lot of work in this area of understanding what automation and digitization is doing and how it's affecting Indigenous communities. So just as a quick, backgrounder, here in Canada, the majority of First Nations communities don't have access to the internet. This is for a few different reasons, but they don't have access to the infrastructure. We pay some of the highest prices in the world here in Canada, so there's a huge affordability issue for those living in small, remote communities, which means that the majority of Indigenous peoples, including our youth and including peoples who would be looking for work, haven't had long-term stable access to technology, and so therefore haven't built up the skills. And this isn't true for all Indigenous peoples in Canada. What I'm trying to highlight is that there is a huge issue of digital inequity and exclusion of Indigenous peoples in the tech space. And so as a result, the work that we do at the Tech Council is to understand how broad and how deep this challenge is, and to work with governments and industry to think about what we need to change in our regulatory systems, what kinds of policies do we need to put in place, and how do we adequately get the right funding to make this a conversation of the past. So I think it's quite right and appropriate that, on Orange Shirt Day, where we are thinking about Canada's legacy and the failure of Canada in respecting Indigenous peoples' ways of being and knowing, and our ways of learning. Residential schools were put in place to assimilate Indigenous peoples, and largely the academic system in Canada hasn't really well served Indigenous people to thrive. So I think there's an opportunity with digital technologies to prepare people for the digitally enabled and becoming reliant economy. And one of the things that has to take place are these steps in truth and reconciliation, and ensuring all Indigenous peoples have the basic human right to access of these technologies as laid out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Indigenous peoples. So we have to start there as a country, and then we have to think about how do we get digital skills into communities, and how do we ensure that that's done in a way that's led by Indigenous peoples, because this isn't about just getting technology into communities and getting Indigenous peoples the skills that everyone is learning. This is about ensuring that Indigenous people are co-creating and leading what their participation in the tech and innovation ecosystem is going to look like.
Thanks for that. Some tremendous points there. I hope we can revisit, particularly to the issue of who might be left behind at the moment without current access to tools. And I think you make a good point about it's not just enough to say, okay, we've put up a tower and now you've got access. There's a little more complication than that. Tammy, I know you wanted to jump in on this, but I wanted to get to Marissa. Marissa, a reminder to unmute. And what has your experience been with digital tools? And I know you sit on some committees that are paying very close attention to how people are being served digitally. I wonder if you might just comment on what's your experience been like.
Yeah, so it's very, very hard because a lot of people are on low income and a lot of people can't afford access to internet. So it's very hard to have that communication, especially because they don't have access.
So you've seen examples of people who don't have the access, and then what do we do? Are those people just left behind? Do people try to reach them anyway? Do you know?
I think it's about getting the proper resources for people that have low income. If people can just have, have the right access, like, okay, Wi-Fi hotspots is a way to get access, but if you don't have, internet on your phone, that can be also very difficult.
Okay, well, thank you. We hear you, and that's very comparable to some of the things Denise was mentioning earlier. I'm going to bring Danielle in just a moment, but Tammy, I know you said you wanted to just jump in on this topic as well.
Sure, I wanted to share our experience, and I completely agree with Denise and Marissa. Access is key. If you don't have access, then you're not even in the game. And because we're all at home, or most of us are at home, if you're even looking for employment, you need to be able to apply online. And so your ability to job search is limited if you don't have access to the systems to apply online. One of the things that I found so one of my program sites is in the eastern part of Toronto. And what they have found is they've marketed what they call a basic computer skills program. And we often have individuals who are employed or who are seeking employment. And they come in and we recognize while they're with us that they also could benefit from some literacy skill development. Oftentimes people are thinking that employment will be the solution, but if they have poor literacy skills, their ability to maintain that job and to move up in that organization can be limited. So we are working and endeavoring in our programs to really create a more hybrid version of a program so that people can believe that and achieve their employment goals, but also build their literacy skills. And in order to navigate technology, you have to have strong literacy skills. Technology changes so quickly and so rapidly. One of the things, one of the benefits of having strong literacy skills is critical thinking and problem solving. And with all the platforms that are coming out, the different changes that are happening, if you're not able to think critically, to problem solve independently, you will struggle with navigating the deluge of information that's coming at us and the various platforms that are now being I'll say, quote unquote, forced on some people, or feel as though they're forced upon individuals to use and in order to participate in conversations and in sort of the activities that are happening around us. So that literacy piece, I just wanted to stress, is super important because you're not able to really use the technology at its fullest potential if you don't have the literacy skills to understand the prompts that may come up on the screen, what it means if you select certain buttons or do certain things. They really do go hand in hand.
Thank you for that. So, Danielle, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get to you, but we've already had a very rich discussion. So we've had a couple of points made so far, and I wonder if you might want to touch on them both. The first is that technological tools can be enormously beneficial, but then we've also heard from a number of people that not everyone has equal access. And I thought, particularly through your experience with Unesco and in other places, that maybe you had a perspective on this. So I'll turn it over to you, and you can tell us what you've been thinking as you've heard the other comments.
Jay, what we're living here in terms of the debate and the integration of technology within the literacy field echoes what's happening around the world. And a year ago, Unesco adopted a new multi-year strategy in literacy. And in the debate that led to that new strategy, that technology part was touched, and there is a strategic priority within the strategy to level all the technological means for literacy. So, and what we've seen is there's like different pieces of a puzzle right now being put on in front of us. There's the hardware dimension, and within UNESCO there's a mobile learning week, and it's interesting because within that yearly week they're documenting the use of cell phone in rural area, especially for excluded people, where the infrastructure, the material brick and mortar infrastructure of learning cannot reach them. So we see an interesting news. There's that other dimension, the app dimension. A lot of homemade apps are built, especially in rural area with different dialects and mother tongues, to allow people to learn in their mother tongue through an app specifically built for them, and with translation functionality to move from their dialect to English. So we see an interesting use of it. And the other dimension, which is the new frontier of adult learning in general and literacy, is the integration of artificial intelligence. It has been used to detect difficulties, learners' difficulties, even following eyeballs, following the time taken to read a page and all that big data, that technology is being used. And if we combine those three dimensions with artificial intelligence through homemade specific app and using mobile phone as a channel, we have the tool there to reach marginalized rural area. And within UNESCO, there's that big political debate. And I will enrich what has been said about the condition beyond the mechanic of the technology. UNESCO is promoting an open educational resources. So not a private based, but to have a more community managed, publicly managed application or broadband, etc. So there's that policy part of it, a non-commercialized perspective on the technology. There's also all that 5G, artificial intelligence, and the ethic part of it. There's an international declaration on the ethics of artificial intelligence being adopted, processed within UNESCO processes, and that brings that ethical part of it. And beside that, the debate of 21st century skills, it's been touched, critical skills that goes way beyond the capacity to use a machine, to use an application. So there's potential, but that potential will be met if we muster it from a public kind of perspective, an ethical perspective, and using it to be able to personalize learning and to bring it in a very adapted way to excluded population. That's the aspiration. The politics and the policy and the debate and the power relation and the private sectors is really involved, and we've seen it in the past few months. UNESCO has signed protocols with Google, with Facebook, with YouTube has been used by a lot of ministry to try to reach excluded population when schools were locked down. So what we're talking about, I see it. I see a hope, an aspiration to use that technology for the greater good, and it has potential, but at the same time, there's economical and political pitfall because it's an industry. But there's some movement within it, discussion about homemade programmation. homemade application and learn. Like in the 80s, we used the computer. In the 80s, learning was a precondition to use computer because the keyboard is letter-based and the interface was letter-based. Now, with voice-activated possibilities, functionalities, there's a new possibilities that opens up. But the thing is, it's highly political, and the ethical, humanist perspective in it is a central fight to make sure that the tool is for the benefit of all.
Well, you've given us a lot to think on there, and this was really part of the prepared questions, but both Denise and Danielle have mentioned the concept of having the recipients involved in their own solutions. Denise, I think you said people need to be part of the solution, and then Danielle, you referred to it as community managed. So I wanted to go to Marissa for a second. Marissa, can you tell us from your perspective, the committees you serve on, I understand that they advocate on behalf of people. Do you feel that the folks you are working with, the people you are representing, are they well involved? Do people think to ask how they want to be part of the solution? How is that working for you?
So in my eyes, again, sometimes it's very hard because we have two options. So we have it online and they can call in and talk to us on the phone. Now, when you're on the phone, you can't really see what's going on, let alone trying to get a question or an answer in, because the people are so focused on the other people that we're seeing. So they're not really focusing on those people that they can't see. They're only focusing on the people that we can see. So that's very hard.
And are you involved? Do people think to ask you, is it working for you? I know, as again, you serve on committees where you're trying to make sure that people's rights are respected. How's that going? Are people paying attention?
Yes, we're trying to make it so that people understand and get their word in, but it's working, but it's also very difficult at times.
Okay, well, thank you for that perspective. Denise, when Danielle was speaking, I could see you at the bottom of my screen nodding rather vigorously. I think it was particularly when he was talking about the people who are currently without access or without tools. Do you want to just say a couple of words? Because I know you touched on it earlier, but I sensed you had more to say.
Yeah, thanks for picking up on that. I've really enjoyed listening to all of the panelists, and everything Danielle is saying is really resonating with me as well. And as part of the conversations we're trying to lift up through different organizations and levels of government is just this advancement of technological integration into our lives and into our communities and into our bodies. And, my biggest concern around this is that we don't have the regulatory system to really be able to manage that in a responsible way. And because it's so heavily market driven, the reason we have these really high prices in the for internet in this country is because there's a monopoly, and we haven't addressed that. And there's a lot of, obviously, billions upon billions of dollars going into these technology companies to make things better, faster, more connected, but we don't really understand yet what the impact of that is in the long term. So this question about ethics and this question about taking a humanistic approach is exactly what we're trying to promote at the First Nations Technology Council. It's the reason we, have had over 3,000 Indigenous people through our programs, because we're trying to lift up the Indigenous wisdom into this conversation. Is really, really important. Indigenous peoples have been the technologists and the innovators in sustainable, humanistic, holistic ways on these territories for millions of years. And I think it's incredibly important that there is this coming together of that wisdom with digital skills and seats at those decision-making, policy-making tables, so that we build something that serves us and serves future generations. So when Danielle was speaking about that, it just was really powerful. And I just want to touch on also what Marissa just said, which really sort of took my breath away there, which is, the focus on who you can see. Those are really powerful words, because that experience is what is happening where, if you think about what's online right now and who's determining what's online, and whether it's the hardware aspect or the app aspect. Another point I liked about what Danielle was saying, these are not community-based approaches. These are built by specific people for specific reasons. And so there's an invisibility of certain communities and peoples. And I just really acknowledge what Marissa said. We share that too. As Indigenous people, we feel unseen and unheard, and that the online spaces aren't built by us for us. So, there's a lot of work to do to ensure that we're able to have access and be in that design process.
So Marianne, I see you have your hand. I'll come to you, but I just wanted to also comment on what Marissa said. I also noted focus on those you can see. And I think that's an interesting takeaway. I think some of us may need to unpack that, but that's a really valid point. And thank you, Marissa, for sharing that. Marianne, you've been quiet for a few minutes. Can you jump in here and share your perspective?
Yes, it's going to be somewhat different from the perspective that I hope to give about learning itself, but rather I'm very struck by what both Denise and Danielle pointed out, which is there are so many factors that are involved that are cultural, political, and even profit-driven. And I wanted everyone to know that there are movements. Maureen Lovett, who is an absolutely extraordinary Canadian researcher from Toronto and Hospital for Sick Children, is part of this, where a group of reading scholars across North America are coming together to build if you will, a roadmap to the building of a reading brain, in which we have curated free digital online activities that go from 0 to 5, from 5 to 10, and from 10 through adolescence. So that I want you to be aware that part of the work that some of us are doing as reading scholars is to get evidence-based activities that are free for children through what's called the Haskins Global Literacy Hub. So it's really important to be able to have antidotes to the more profit-driven aspects. So I want people to realize this is a resource for all of us. It's ongoing, and we have much work to do, but we certainly are involved with it.
Marianne, I'm going to jump in there because I actually wanted to ask you about something as well. Your department is the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. And I thought that was an interesting trio of things to highlight. And it sounds like what some of us have been talking about for the last several minutes really connects quite directly to social justice. So I presume having social justice in the handle was quite deliberate. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, in fact, when I was asked to come to UCLA, the name would have been something like this Center for Dyslexia. But in reality, for me, what we learned about dyslexia is not only about dyslexia, but about all diverse learners, all learners. And what is underlying all of that is the belief that literacy must be considered a basic human right. I know Unesco is involved in that. There's so many organizations in India, Pratham. All of us have this same underlying premise that it is literacy that gives us the foundation for a learning trajectory for the rest of the life. And without thinking about it as a basic human right, we also are making ourselves open to some of the statistics that you are quoting in Canada. In the United States, I assure you it is much worse. where 60% of our children in 4th grade and 8th grade are not reaching levels like what Tammy said about critical analysis. They are not reaching the levels of proficiency that allow them to become true citizens of a country. So for me, the premise of a basic human right is completely connected in an arc to the state of a democratic union. So social justice is a piece of that around the world.
Interesting how many people from different parts of the world have come to this human rights conclusion at approximately the same time. We did a study a couple of years ago about the connection between literacy and poverty, and one of the chief findings was we need to consider literacy a human right. And in fact, I'm reminded that if you go back to 1899, people much smarter than me, the people who founded Frontier College, had two main premise. One, anywhere can be a learning place, and that's certainly true as today as any other time. Second, literacy is a human right.
Yes.
Marissa, I'm going to come to you in just a minute because I know you've got some research that I'd like you to share, but we've had an interesting question posed from one of our listeners or viewers today, and that is, what do we do about seniors? I'm just going to call up the question here, and because the question, do organizations work with literate seniors who've lost the ability maybe to operate a telephone or iPad or have some cognitive loss? I don't know if any of you, I don't know, Tammy, if your programs intersect with seniors at all, or if anyone else has had experience with this. Tammy, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. So in one of my programs, we do often work with seniors. Their goal is just to further their independence. And so they make up many of the participants who come to our computer program, and they want to be able to connect with family members. It's not a measure that is, I'd say, counted for us in terms of a main objective, but we recognize that there is a void there. I know that there are other organizations that partner young people with seniors to build their computer proficiency. And I think in light of what's happening, we probably will have more mature individual seniors coming into our program trying to reduce the isolation that they found and encountered. What we have also encountered in terms of our programming right now is those considered seniors are not as comfortable working remotely. And so we are trying to reach out to them. We're trying and piloting a modified version of computer skills development remotely. But for people who have a fear of technology, it's best for them, and there's a preference from them to build their skills in person. And so right now, it has been a challenge working with that population because their preference is to build that skill in a face-to-face environment, and that this current climate doesn't quite allow for that to happen.
Thank you for that, for the question. So I wanted to address one other thing that we alluded to off the top, and that is that Marianne has done research from sort of a neuroscience perspective to talk about how the brain learns. And I think, Marianne, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you were looking at young brains. And if I'm not mistaken, you had discerned some sort of a distinction between digital, the way brains absorb, but let's say printing in digital format as opposed to the page. And I'll stop there because I'm probably not doing it justice. Why don't you just tell us what your research found and what its implications are?
Thank you so much. The reality is that for the last 10 years, I have been struck by the fact that there are growing differences when we read the same passage in print versus text. And I'll say that this is from a cognitive neuroscience viewpoint. And I've written about it in a recent book called Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, for those who will have questions that can be resolved in reading that book. But the reality is that we have a plastic reading brain, and that means the circuit itself is different. So those of the audience who are listening and reading in French actually have a somewhat different circuit than the one that we use for English, which is itself very much more different from the ones that are used in China to use for a local syllabary. So in other words, the circuit is plastic. Well, it will reflect not only differences in writing systems, But in mediums, the emphases in different mediums will have different emphases on what that circuit does. So that the digital, which is an amazing advantage for reading a lot of information very quickly and for multitasking, that's a great advantage. But it disadvantages the slower, more abstract and sophisticated processes that underlie what I call deep reading, which include inference, analogy, very importantly, empathy, perspective taking, and in my opinion, most important, the integration of all that with critical analysis. So I want to give you one study so that I don't talk too long, but this is the largest meta-analysis that we have. It's done by the eRead network in Europe, though I will say that the SSHRC Canadian partnership with Janet Werker is going to be doing something similar in her multi-literacy project. But the reality is when you analyze data from over 171,000 young adults, simply reading the same passage in print versus digital, they are doing better in comprehension and sequencing the details of the plot, etc., on print. Even more important to your viewers and to all of us, because we are all, there's no going back. We need to know advantages and disadvantages. We need to realize that when you take a subset of that 20 years or 17 years of studies and only look at the last ones, the digital natives, the last years of that study, the young adults who we would call most adept on digital devices are even better in print than earlier. And the reason, which we hypothesize, is what they say themselves. They perceive themselves better digitally because they say we're faster, making the huge mistake that speed is giving them access to those deep reading processes that they're unaware of. All of this is in milliseconds. But the reality is that when we become so accustomed to the digital set that distracts our attention and doesn't give us the same focus, we are less likely, it's not impossible ever, but we are less likely to read at a level of immersion. But we are more likely, and that's what I think you were saying earlier about the eye movement research. The eye movement research shows us that we're becoming basically a world of skimmers who go either like a Z, we go zzz, 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 or an F, but we are skimming, which is not giving us enough time to process at deeper levels. Now that's the negative. The positive, remember, is that there are so many things that the digital devices give us. Practice of foundational skills, give us all this complementary knowledge. So my, if you will, beginning proposal over the last 2 years is that we should be thinking about a biliterate brain in which the earliest experiences are much more print and book based, and we learn those deep reading skills there and then learn to transfer them with care so that ultimately we can read deeply and purposefully on any medium. But we have to know that there are advantages and disadvantages. And research is ongoing. As I said, Canada is going to have this multi-literacy study through Janet Werker. The eRead network is in Europe and Israel. And there's a group of us like Naomi Barron and myself who are trying very hard to look at advantage, disadvantage, and going forward. So we preserve the best of what we have as we expand into ever more digital natives for all of us. That's a long-winded answer.
That's a lot to unpack in a few minutes, but thank you for that. We do have a question from our audience for you. I'll just read it as it came to me. Will young brains be more adaptable to reading digitally for deep reading, or will they have the same limitations?
It is first, I want to say that is a beautiful question. the reality appears, and this is from brain imaging work that is going on, that that young brain, especially at 3 and 4, if that brain is being given that same material on digital devices, and let's just say a fairy tale is either an audio or a video or being read to by the caretaker, the parent, the sibling, the brain regions that are responsible for language are more activated by the person-to-person communication, so that these early skills are actually, they are being, if you will, better promoted by us, the human being, than the machine. And so it's my opinion that right now, based on the research, and this is ongoing research, that even though that adaptable brain is there, it's learning bad habits by having attention so continuously distracted, and it's accustomed to that. So that Linda Stone uses the term that we are raising a generation of children with continuous partial attention. Those are some of the disadvantages of digital that I would very much want to suggest there are antidotes to that, by more emphasis on books and print in the beginning, and then the gradual integration and teaching carefully digital wisdom in literacy over time.
So I guess it's appropriate then that you serve on the board of an organization that looks specifically at children's literacy, because you've got a lot to offer on that topic. And as I said, we work closely with them. Danielle, again, I seem to have left you out of the loop briefly, and I didn't mean to, but I do have a question for you. Our friends at Literacy Quebec had you on a podcast not too long ago, and you made some interesting comments. I'll try and remember exactly, but I think your words were parallel worlds, referring to, and some of what Marianne said is sort of relevant here, that traditional learning and digital learning are kind of moving in parallel worlds. From that, I wondered if you mean they're going along but not talking to each other. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Yeah, we're in some sense we're benefiting of a success. In Canada, around 2/3 of the population, adult population, has post-secondary education. We're the second country in the world, so we've been successful in creating a new generations of learners that have cognitive ability, if I use that dimension, and knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, and they're more comfortable learning. And so we have in one world what I call that new frontier of learning, app-based, and we've seen it expanding in the past few months. Self-regulated online learning, autonomous learning, Coursera, YouTube, Udemy. There's a plethora of platforms where people autonomous, financially, cognitively, as learners, can learn. And there's that 1/3 of the population that might have high school or not, or have low level of literacy skills. And more, they're pushed aside of our learning world. And I will go as far to say that since we've constructed our modern society around the written word, we've created a potential discriminatory factor. If you cannot read and write systematically, the society is organized around writing and reading. And historically, adult education had the social mission and the philosophical mission to be a second chance school, at least. Right now, adult learning, through the vast majority of the offer, online specifically, fee-based, and all that, is allowing people who already have to get way more. And I've seen so many programs in the spring during the COVID where become recycle yourself, become a data specialist manager, half the cost. And so that was answering to people who were autonomous within that new learning world, technologically based. And so in the 60s, 70s, where close to 1/3 or half of the population didn't have a diploma or were at low level of literacy skill, government had a mass problem, a volume problem. It had to deal with the needs of a large part of the population. Now they're becoming a minority. a third, a quarter. And so the government is more and more backing away from adult learning and letting the market. So that those are the two parallel universes. At one point, the distance between being weakly literate and being functional was not that wide. Right now, it's years, and a person cannot benefit from all the development. And I'm documenting new platform-based, AI-based, of autonomous learning, fee-based, personalized learning environment. Myself, I'm comfortable in it. I'm the prototype of the customers that they're targeting. But they're not made. They don't have a justice-based perspective. They have a profit-based perspective. And so that those are those two worlds. And the right to, it's not a coincidence that the human right case for literacy is being put at the forefront, is we all feel that something is being lost. Literacy is not mainstreamed anymore. It's pushed aside as a political topic, as a program-oriented, as subsidy. I mean, now we're talking about upskilling and reskilling. I mean, we're not talking about getting literacy. Upskilling, it's people employed who need more. Reskilling, it's people who just lost their job for good and need to change. So those will be the priority for the next 12 to 15, 18 months. Literacy is far away. And that 21st century debate, skills debate, also kind of marginalized literacy, because you could have a PhD and not be creative, not have problem solving. So those competencies are generic, being schooled or not. So by focusing on that, we're moving policies moving away, and it's moving in sync with a new world and leaving behind, marginalizing way more the 20th century world of literacy. So it's not a coincidence that the human rights case for literacy is put at the forefront, because we're losing it, if I may say so.
I absolutely agree.
Thank you for that, Danielle. It's obvious how passionate everyone on the panel is about this issue. I have found, from our perspective at Frontier College, one of the hurdles in getting attention to the issue is convincing people that it's actually a problem. If you Google literacy in Canada, one of the top hits says something like, "Oh, the nation has a 99% literacy rate." Well, no one defines that, but it's not very helpful to try to convince politicians or decision makers that it's an issue when perhaps they don't all move in the same circles as perhaps some of the people we're endeavoring to help. I will remind our viewers that we'd be happy to take questions from them. They can do it in the chat, or they can do it by emailing to literacy@frontiercollege.ca. While we're waiting for questions, perhaps Tammy, I'll just go back to you briefly. And I wondered, first of all, if you've also experienced this issue with people not really acknowledging that literacy is even an issue in Canada, first of all, and how you might respond to that.
Sure. I love, there's so many nuggets in what Danielle has shared with us. With my programs, we are funded through an Employment Ontario bucket, which is a ministry bucket. And although we are required to, or should be, collaborating with our employment partners, we have a desire to do that. And I'm sure they do as well, but it doesn't always fit, because as Danielle's pointed out, the two pathways are they're growing broader. And so although we are tasked with preparing our literacy learners for employment, it takes much longer for them to get to that upskilling place. And our partners, sometimes based on their mandates, aren't always feeling encouraged, for a number of reasons, to refer their individuals to us for upskilling or literacy development, because they feel like it's just the void is too wide and it will take too long. And so it creates challenges for us in terms of preparing people realistically and trying to offer some concurrent programs. The aspect of AI, I think, is great if you have the skills and comprehension to recognize how it's used effectively. But AI, for somebody who has low literacy skills, still doesn't resolve the issues that they have. You can use Siri and Alexa all you want, but if you don't understand how to really discern the risks attached to that, if you don't understand some of the other things that come up, then you're still at a disadvantage. I will say that what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of focus on the employment programs. With the pandemic, we are looking at how we can better partner with our employment partners so that we can build better connections for our individuals. We are looking at how we can create some boutique programs that will prepare our candidates for employment. But we do recognize that with technology and with the other gaps that they bring to the table, it's a longer journey, and we are trying to advocate for them. We're trying to advocate that they can still be employed. They just may need different supports to find employment. That's not always an easy message to sell, though. And people are tasked with trying to get things done quickly, and the pace in which our participants may learn. And because of the challenges of our program, we're a part-time program, as many of us are, it just takes longer. And so being able to advocate for individuals has been an uphill challenge because people want to get things done quickly. Employers want to, hire people right away. Community agencies want to get their individuals placed right away, and we're still trying to play catch up with our individuals and get them placed and supported. So we haven't found the solution, but we continue to advocate and stress that our individuals can be employed. And we think that with all the funding that's out there for job placements, if we could, in my ideal world, encourage employers to carve out some of the placement hours to allow for upskilling for those who are farther behind, they can maintain a solid employee base. But that's not always an easy sell, and that's not a role that we play at Frontier College, unfortunately. But we do work with our partners to try and encourage and influence them to create those types of partnerships for the people that we work with.
So thank you, Denise. Again, I saw you nodding vigorously. I wondered if you wanted to jump in, and it's your poor fortune that you're right on my screen and I can see you. But did you have comments about some of Tammy's points and about the people who are left behind, and even the belief that maybe literacy isn't an issue? I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. I'm a very active listener, so thanks for picking up that. Yeah, certainly. I think, one of our challenges as well for Indigenous peoples across Canada is raising the flag that this is a challenge. And so, I really agree with the points. There is a problem of definition, both around literacy and connectivity, because I've received the same messages for years up until recently, but the same message around, well, according to our data, what we see is most Indigenous peoples are connected to the internet, and that literacy and everything else is all improving. So there's kind of this movement away from continuing to understand the breadth of the challenge and the way in which it is changing in this digital and connected environment. And just to the point too around resourcing, I think it's something that will take a lot of collective and comprehensive action for those of us who are citizens to ensure that our elected officials understand that funding and the way that the funding grants and contributions are being designed are heavily towards economic development and growth. And this is true for us. I hear this across Canada. So all of the money, even for us, that we're able to access is only for Indigenous peoples who have the skills that are ready to be just increased, enough in the digital skills space that they're then able to get employment within 30 weeks of our program. This is not the case for, the majority of peoples and how we would like to operate. We would like to bring digital skills to the community. This is our way. We would like our young people to learn aside with their elders and learn with their family members and share stories in their languages and have conversations. And that's, a community-based approach to learning. It makes it really difficult when all of the program dollars are designed for us to extract certain individuals and then have them move into certain places in the economy. It's just not a community-based approach, and I think it does have consequences. And so I think this need for us to explain and to continue to define together as citizens that literacy and the importance of literacy in the ways that all of us, and young people especially, are going to be interacting with the learning environment continues to need resources for research, for community discussion, and for, you know, allocation of resources away from just employment and skills development. And so I'll just leave it at that. I really agree with those points.
Well, that's interesting. I see Marianne has her hand up. Did you want to jump in here? And yeah, just you're on mute there, Marianne.
Very, very quickly, I want to support completely what both Denise and Tammy were saying, but I want to emphasize that, just as Tommy was saying, we have to get this critical analytic mind ready, prepared. I think some of the work, for example, the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation is aiming for that 25%, those Indigenous peoples, those marginalized people who are not getting the early literacy skills that will give them the capacity to be on the pipeline to then be hired. So I think there's a real important part that has to be about children in all this discussion about economics. And second, and I'll make this very quick, but in California, we've been doing a very fine analysis of how much is lost to the economy when people are not able to enter it at that highest level of being a proficient literacy person. It's billions and billions of dollars, about 500,000, $500,000 per person who isn't really able to do what they might be able to do. That is a loss to society. So there are economic arguments and there are developmental arguments for rethinking about the big picture of how we are really going to deal with this multifaceted issue of literacy.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. We did have a question. I wasn't 100% sure if I understood it, but I'll go ahead. I think it's for you, Marianne. So the question is, my children are bilingual, where they've learned both French and English at the same time. Can we apply a bilingual approach where parents care to do both? I think perhaps they're asking about a bilingual approach in terms of technology for instruction.
Yes, so there's been a lot of wonderful research, including by a lot of Canadian researchers, Ellen Bialstock, just many people who are suggesting that in early bilingualism, one parent, one language makes it easier for that child to learn. And so the question is quite a thought-provoking one that I don't have the answer to, but I really enjoy the question itself. And that would be whether or not one parent would be always print and the other parent always digital. I don't know the answer, but it certainly would be an interesting research study. And I love the kind of flexible thinking that went into that question.
So I have another question from the audience. Thank you to our questioners. The question is, with the next PIAC survey, so that's a survey of literacy levels, to be administered in 2021, any thoughts on how we can move the information forward so that we're all talking about literacy deficits and skill gaps the same way? Maybe I'll look to Danielle for this, because you have quite a broad international perspective through your work with Unesco and others. So Danielle, did you catch that, or did you want me to repeat the question?
No, I got the question. I was just thinking about the answer.
Sorry,
because I was thinking of it as a francophone, because in the Anglo-Saxon word, the word literacy, there's health literacy, financial literacy, body literacy, and there's a way more complex. But what I understand from the semantic in English is, and it's also what the PIAC tried to measure, is your capacity to understand a communicational object, being a text or your body or your financial statement or whatever. So it's more on the understanding part. The thing is, science and ideology meet there, because by focusing on literacy, and in Canada, essential skills has been used a lot in Anglophone provinces. Literacy is used. In Quebec, alphabétisation is still used. Literacy a bit, essential skill not really. Sorry for the translator there. I just shift from two languages, and so what's being measured, I think it's useful because it's an international, it allows us to understand. But the positive of it is it focuses on, can you understand a written or a word-based communication? And the spectrum, the multi-level way of literacy, that it's not you are literate or you're not, it's more, but at the same time, there's pitfalls because, I mean, those big tools are for international comparison and palmarès and top 10 and all that. So that's the philosophy in it, and also for workforce mobility to have an international measurement that allows us to know where we are from each other. And they're based in French and English here in Canada, the two official languages. So it doesn't measure natives languages. So, but what I've seen and feel in policymaking, I'm more at the policymaking level. It's been used to structure policy. And what we said, I think it's Tammy said earlier, that policies tend to target more people who are not far from employment. Those are level 2, and government will say, I'll deal with level 2 because they're level 2 on the 5-level scales. So they've been used to organize policy and focus on level 2 and marginalizing level 1. People who are further away from a fully functional or more advanced functional, and those level 1 are 15-70% of the 16 years old plus population. So I feel like in technology in general, it's what you do with it. So is it done to push forward? From an advocate point of view, it's always been a useful report. It allows us to make the argument for literacy. But at the same time, it's used in policy to just split over the problem and focused on level 2, which are not that far from employment, etc. So to me, it's the intention behind. And there's a lot of literature about the weakness of some aspect of the tool, but I wouldn't get into that specific topic. But I will focus just what I see as a debate among the literacy organization. The early 2000, when the report was published, and that 50% number, level 2 and less, people thought, that's way too bigger, it's impossible, it cannot be half of the population who are illiterate. And from further report, we moved back to using level 1. So even among us, as advocates within the adult literacy world, we're kind of contaminated by the epistemological organization of the report and talking about level 1 and 2 and not talking about in your life. Are you able to read and write what you need to just go through, to go to the grocery store, to understand a more contextualized based literacy with your relation with the written word in your work? Are you able to go through it? That's a different perspective than saying level 1 and 2. And if policies were more targeted and grounded and anchored in life situations, literacy in different life situations, and allowing people to go to the pharmacy, to go to the grocery, to go to the bank, to work, etc., we would have very different literacy policies, I do think. But that's the bad effect of the PIAC. It's been a success, and it structured the debate, sadly enough.
So thank you, Danielle. As always, some really rich comments there. Perhaps there's a role for you and I and the others around the table and all the literacy organizations represented to put our heads together and come up with some terminology that we might share and pick the statistics we think are most valuable. But I really compliment you on what you said about it's all very fine and well to talk about level 1 or level 2, but are people able to function? Are they able to get the information they need? You used the example of the pharmacy. Now, more important than ever before, are people able to access healthcare info? We have a couple more questions, but I just wanted to touch base with Marissa, who we haven't chatted with in a while. Marissa, there's been some discussion about how a lot of programs are aimed at people who are employed, and maybe the program will get them a better job, or that maybe there's people that are sort of being missed or left behind. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that.
Yes, people that are that can't communicate and have trouble speaking, that use a talking device, that don't communicate verbally, and they need a talking device. And sometimes when the person talks that doesn't have a voice that uses a talking device, they think that they're speaking to a machine instead of talking to that person that has a talking device. People get like hung up on because people think that it's a machine, not somebody else communicating with them.
So that's a very valuable point. Thank you for sharing that. If I think back to a previous comment you made about focusing on the people they can see, so that is not focusing on people they can't see, and then you just indicated that they might not be hearing some people as well. Those are very powerful statements, and I invite all of our colleagues from literacy organizations to keep those very important points in mind, because if the individuals that we are endeavoring to help in part may not feel seen or heard, that's not a very good situation at all. So thank you for raising that important point. The next question from our crowd comes to Denise. Denise, how might an internet or an intranet, an internal internet or an intranet that allows residents to share learning and entertainment resources together work given the cost of the internet in the North? So Denise, I'll let you answer that.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And just my apologies. I got a note saying my internet is unstable. So please let me know if you cannot hear me. Ironic. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity here, especially for access in the North. And I just want to point to the recent speech from Throne. There was a mention about a universal broadband fund. This is over $1 billion fund to ensure all Canadians have access. And I just want to note too that, I mean, although that's a lot of infrastructure money, there's still the affordability side. The thing I would stress here is that I think each community should really feel empowered and able to determine for themselves what kind of infrastructure you want in your community and how you want to operate it. There is a lot, especially in British Columbia, there's a lot of pressure from larger telecommunications companies to come in and serve you with the best infrastructure that they have and the tools that they have and the applications they'd like to run on the networks they'd like to build in your community as well. So just stressing that, yes, absolutely, I agree with this question very much. I think that there's a lot that can be done by building your own network. I'd really encourage folks to also take a look at some of the really interesting work happening around the world with the Internet Society. I'm a member and part of an Indigenous connectivity group. So we kind of look at Indigenous-led solutions for building community-led networks. So there's a lot of great resources there. And I think that, through thinking about those examples, you can think about exactly, how you might access this universal broadband fund when it comes available, and what kind of network design you would like to propose, and perhaps do that with the citizens in your community. And I think that there's a lot of merit in it too, thinking about data sovereignty, and also one of the things we're thinking about as BC First Nations is spectrum sovereignty. Our Aboriginal rights and title to the spectrum hanging over our nations. So it is something to think about. This thinking from a user-centered design kind of way. What do our people need? What do they want? And how do we build it out from there instead of just accepting whatever is being proposed to us? So I like that community-based approach. I think that's great.
Tremendous. Thank you. We have a question specifically for Danielle. Danielle, the question is, as practitioners, how can we get our governing bodies to take the UNESCO Global Report seriously? And Danielle, maybe you just say in a sentence or two why that report is important. And then for the benefit of the folks dialing in today, how can we get the powers that be in our own world to pay attention to it?
Yeah, that's my daily job. If the question is relevant because we're not successful fully, but the Global Report on Adult Learning is an international report made every 3 years. It's the main source of information about adult learning around the world, but it's more than that because what it's documenting, it's international obligation. So every 3 year UNESCO sends survey to all the member states, including Canada, and the government have to be accountable of international obligation. So there's that technocratic dimension, but there's also an advocacy tool. It is an advocacy tool. That's as ICA and with the Canadian UNESCO Commission, we're using that report and the process of data collection, and we're getting the input of civil society. Right now, we're consulting Canadian civil society about some of the question in the survey to get the input and do advocacy work. I would say more fundamentally, and just coming back, because we're dealing with the right to education there, the international right to education, and literacy is part of it, and formal monitoring by UNESCO and regarding Canada. And the right to education has not been a top-down gift. It's been a bottom-up fight. And whatever tool we can use, every social rights were not given by the monarch to the subjects. They were asked for and fought for by civil society and organization. And right now, we might have thought we won the literacy argument. But when we dig into it, that might not be literacy who's weaker in our case. It's adult learning as a global field. We see it now. The government, when the COVID started and they closed school, the first measure they did, it's going the youth-based school-based education, and mainly primary school. And it reminded me that the international right to education in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's school-based oriented, primary and secondary, and literacy kind of find its way there. But adult education is not a priority. So the Grail is an instrument we have internationally and nationally to push government to answer a set of basic questions about what's going on with adult education, and literacy is a subfield having specific questions. But it's more depressing than anything else when you get the answer. The tool is welcome, but what we want is positive answer. And that's why I feel I'm not a practitioner. I'm more at high level policy analysis, but I feel literacy slipping away of the debate, the policy debate. Even now, I've been disappointed at the international initiative because they focused on getting youth back to school. I mean, there's close to 1 billion people illiterate around the world, and it's not literacy level 1. It's not being able to read and write a basic sentence. And what I like about Marianne and the neuroscience in general, that it reminds us that the right to education is not a philosophical legal thing. It's deeply grounded in our brain, and it's an anthropological and neurological right. If you don't have the content and the ability, you're missing something. And I find that the Grail is a tool, but the fight is tough to keep literacy somewhere within the mainstream of the policy debate. A testimony from my daily work there.
Well, it sounds like you must have an interesting day job. I would like you to know that on behalf of Frontier College, count us in. We are a long-standing national organization, and if you think we can add to your voice and do things that will help, we'd like to. And I invite all the people who are joining the call today who represent literacy organizations. I'm fairly on pretty solid ground by saying we're stronger together than operating separately. So let's see if we can do something about that. That's the end of the questions I've been given. We're almost at the end of our time, but I will just ask the panelists if anyone has anything you were dying to say that you didn't get a chance to, that you had a lovely answer prepared for a question I didn't ask? Does anyone have anything that you would like to just say in 60 seconds or so off top? Danielle, were you okay? Did you have anything to add?
Just an image I had at one point is the brick and mortar school was a technology at some point. Getting kids at generations after generation within a space and having a multidisciplinary, multi-level, multi-year system was a technology. At first, it was private-based. It became public in the 50s and 60s because people asked for it. I feel now that we're kind of close to a tipping point with technology. The internet space and the educational dimension of it is mainly private. And slowly we're getting a public-based common good perspective in it. There's a lot of topic, open educational resources, etc., and what Denise referred to. There's a lot of hope because there's a lot of intelligence and technological know-how from a new generation of advocate for internet. So I do feel that what we lived a century or 2 centuries ago with the school brick and mortar technology-based system, we're living it now with the internet. And that's why civil society has to get into the political debate, and learners, first and foremost, have to be there to claim what's there if they're learning, and if I use Marianne perspective, their brain.
Okay, tremendous. Denise, just 30, 60 seconds of anything you want to say? Go ahead.
Sure. I just want to really thank everyone on the panel and everyone who tuned in today to this conversation. And I just want to say that if you're called to want to deepen your relationship or your allyship with Indigenous peoples on this topic, I really invite you to visit the First Nations Technology Council.ca. We're an unfunded organization. It's so important right now for organizations like ours to be advocating for the rights of our peoples and our community. And if you are so called, please join us. Please reach out. We would love to chat further.
Well, thank you for that and for that lovely offer. Marissa, I will just ask if there's anything you wanted to add that you didn't get a chance to before, or any closing thoughts. You'd be welcome to share them if you wish.
Nope, I'm good. I'm fantastic.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your perspective today. Marianne, you just happen to be next to block on my screen. Do you have any last 30 seconds or so? Oh, you're just muted there, Marianne.
I simply want to both thank everyone on the panel and everyone who is actually listening, but I want to underscore to everyone that it's not just a basic human right, this literacy that we're also thinking about. It is the basis for not just deep literacy, but deep thought. And that is what we most need in a democracy. And anything that impedes critical analysis and empathy in the ways we read needs to be taken very seriously, because that's what makes our citizens susceptible to fake news, false news, and demagoguery. We have to have true thinkers, and literacy is one of our most important vehicles for achieving that.
Wow, that's very powerful. So I guess the last word goes to the first and last word to you, Tammy. So do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure. I feel like Marianne should have ended the forum.
Well, that was powerful, but so no pressure.
Really, in line with what Marianne is saying, I don't think it should be an either or. Literacy is critical and it's important. Technology has its place and is necessary based on where we are moving as a society. And so we have a role to play as literacy providers in helping our participants to build their literacy skills so that they can navigate the technological technological sort of environment that they're going to be a part of, whether it be accessing healthcare, employment, or just for general independence. Not all of our participants are seeking employment. Some of them simply want to feel more confident in their ability to navigate the systems that are upon us. And I think sometimes oftentimes they're being left out of the loop because there's a focus on children and youth perhaps, and recognizing the need to support them. I work with adults, so that's my bias. People who are looking for employment, but those who simply want to be able to navigate spaces independently, those people are often left behind, and there is limited funding, in some cases no funding, to support those individuals. I work with a great team of staff who are doing their best to pivot and shift, but there's never enough dollars. Our programs are part-time because there isn't enough funding to really allow people to participate in the ways in which would be meaningful for them. So I think if we can, ensure that literacy is part of that, as we're speaking to our partners, we're advocating to have them refer individuals to us. But social services, we talk about parole officers, all those individuals, we want them to really think about the impact literacy has on those that they're working with. And as we're all trying to build our technology skills, recognizing that in order to do that well, you still need literacy. You're not able to perform at a high rate and at a high skill level if you don't have the literacy skills that are necessary to be able to perform and thrive in that environment. So I'll stop there.
Tremendous. Well, thank you. And thank you all, the panelists. I thought this was a very rich discussion. I want to thank everyone who dialed in and gave us 90 minutes of your time. There's a few people I want to thank, and then I'll make a few closing comments. But first, I will say thank you to our generous founding sponsor, Canada Life. As I mentioned off the top, Canada Life has been sponsoring us for a number of years. And as the title implies, they were the founding sponsor of this particular discussion. We've had them for a long time. And I want to do a call out to Debbie Down and Marion Jones, great people to work with. And again, we look forward to working with you again in future years. And of course, to Cisco, especially Willa Black and Alyssa Coop, thank you for your long-term support and for this wonderful format today. You were very patient with us as we went through a few rehearsals here and there, so thanks for that. And there's a couple of people at Frontier College behind the scenes. I would like to do a shout out to Christina Slowecki, who helped us with setting up the bits and pieces of the translation. Safia Vavasagam, we very much appreciate all of your help behind the scenes. Jen Chow, who more or less put it all together, and then Meredith Roberts, who works very closely with Jen. I will just say in closing, we've talked a lot about the various goals learners might have, and certainly employment or better employment is a viable one. You've heard a lot of our panelists, though, talk about the need to look beyond that. And I will tell you quickly, I encountered one learner whose goal was to be able to help their grandkids with their math homework. And I thought that was a pretty good goal, even if it doesn't end in formal education, at least for the grandparent, maybe it will for the grandchildren. I heard lots today about people being seen and heard, or perhaps more tragically, not being seen and not being heard. And I think that was a really valuable piece to take away, particularly when we talk about the opportunities for digital learning. Who are we seeing? Who are we hearing? Who are we ignoring? I challenge all of us today to pay attention to those powerful words, and I very much appreciate Marissa bringing that to our attention. I will say that the conversation doesn't end today. It occurs to me that we have tremendous advantages with digital learning. It's not available to all. We may want to have a blend of traditional and digital for the sake of the growth of the brain. And one very big thing I heard was that communities and people need to be involved in their own solutions. With that, I will say thank you, everyone, and we look forward to talking more about literacy. Bye for now.